Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Echemo wash processed Ethiopia from Tim Wendelboe. And there's the bag right there. And Tim Wendelboe, based out of Oslo, Norway. And they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel on numerous occasions, and one of the most loved coffee roasters in the entire world. Now, the main reason for purchasing and reviewing this coffee is actually because of the other coffee that we're going to be reviewing from them, as that's the one that caught my interest the most. But I figured since we were already ordering from Tim Wendelboe, I might as well order this coffee, as we've never reviewed any of their wash processed Ethiopian coffees. So it'll definitely be interesting to see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 41. The recipe we went with for this coffee was Tim Wendelboe's recipe, which is a 15.38 to 1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 99 degrees Celsius, about 210 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee, it is definitely a very light coffee, as Tim Wendelboe is one of the lighter roasting coffee roasters in Europe, as they are one of the infamous places that coined the term Nordic Light, as this is a very light coffee by most standards and metrics. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 17, first impression, and we opted for the V60, and it was definitely a little bit more herbal than expected, but it was very much in line with the listed tea notes, as they do have a white tea note on here. The cup does improve a fair bit on the cool down with a much more well-defined honeysuckle-like aspect, with plenty of lingering herbality once again. So a pretty solid start, and I found it funny that, of course, even a wash-processed Ethiopian coffee would have that herbality, as Tim Wendelboe is infamous for really enjoying their herbal coffees. Continue on to day 20, as we opted for the Chemex, and this one was a little bit more citric focused, as there was plenty of the listed stone fruit aspects present within the finish itself. Pretty clean, but once again, the herbality is very present, as there's a bit of an extended finish too. But for the most part, a pretty straightforward wash-processed Ethiopian coffee, just offering something slightly different than you might traditionally experience with one. Day 24 through the April brewer, and there's a bit more to this cup, as there's better vibrancy and intensity with much more of the peachy qualities to it, especially within the finish. So I actually found some really nice qualities through this brew method, as the herbality is still present throughout the entirety of it, but the maybe less desirable characteristics did include an ever so slight citric grain quality that was pretty pronounced, actually, surprisingly, given that the entire cup just had a little bit more intensity. Everything in it was more pronounced: the peachy qualities, the citric qualities, the herbal qualities. But in addition to that, that kind of interesting grain quality was also present. So take the good and the bad, I guess, with that brew method. We continue on to day 26, as we opted for the V60 with Tim Wendelboe's recipe. And interestingly enough, it was not necessarily quite as good as some of the previous days, as there was little less definition to the floral and fruit aspects, rather skewing a fair bit on the herbality once again. So I'm like, okay, well, this is going to be very much a Tim Wendelboe coffee. I feel like it's one of those coffees I would have been able to pick out from a lineup among a bunch of other washed Ethiopian coffees. In general, there was an increase in the tea-like aspects, so this one was just okay. Actually, interestingly, one of my least favorite days of this coffee. But we continue on to day 29, as we ran it through the Chemex with Tim Wendelboe's recipe. And interestingly, this is the best it had been up to this point, as there was much better definition to the fruit aspects, with a better defined peachiness and just more sweetness in general, as I would not necessarily say that this coffee, at least from the start, was ever going for great sweetness. Herbality is still present, but interestingly a little bit more toned down, as it felt a little bit more like a refreshing tea. So I really enjoyed this day, especially relative to the previous experience we had had of it. Day 32, back through the V60 with Tim Wendelboe's recipe, and now it's the best it had been up to this point, as I'm not entirely sure what happened on that day 26 mark, but running it back on that day 32 mark really did seem to offer a little bit more, as there was a nice candied sweetness to the cup. That, of course, a little bit more in line with the citric qualities of this one, but the definition seems to be increasing just in general, as there's a bit more of the candied lemon and a softer peach within the cup. Nice bit of brightness to the finish, but overall just a pretty solid day, as I found some really great structure to this one and just some pretty nice beauty to what it was in general. Day 35, another day through the Chemex with Tim Wendelboe's recipe, and this is when I settled on the V60, as I had one really good day with the Chemex, and I had one mediocre, I wouldn't say mediocre, just okay day with the Chemex, and vice versa for the V60. But given that that day 35 mark was my less impressive day with the Chemex, so let's stick with the V60, as it had much more of the citric profiles to it with general improvement. But This time there was much more of that herbal floral sense with a little bit more of that honey attributes to it as well. So it was fine, but given the previous experience of that V60, I said that's been much better. That's why on day 38, when we made the tasting wheel, one more try through the V60 with Tim Wendelboe's recipe. And I'm actually really happy it's the best it had been, because I love making the tasting wheel when the coffee is at its best, as it feels pretty well structured, with a tea forward cup right off brew before settling into a diverse range of citric lemon forward fruits, then followed by a softer peach, and even some melon-like attributes that should be represented in the tasting wheel. Florality still has the more herbal floral sense to it and is reminiscent of what I would describe as being those white flowers. And there's also a brightness that skews a little bit above average for an Ethiopian coffee, but I would say, given that this is still a Tim Wendelboe coffee, then that shouldn't come as a big of a surprise, given that they are a later roasting coffee roaster. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s, so let's go through those real quick. Again, we'll start with the cleanliness, level 4. Yeah, I don't think that there was ever any doubt that I was at least going to score that level 4 mark. We do have a washed Ethiopian coffee. I feel like I don't even know where to necessarily go on that clarity, because of course you're going to expect it to score that level 4, but I think a lot of people, knowing just how well Tim Wendelboe does with their coffees, could say there's a chance it could have scored that level 5, and the only thing that may have held it back was that it really did skew a lot in that herbal direction, but there wasn't necessarily tremendous definition to that part of it. It's much more the other characteristics that at times were very well defined, but it would have been a huge stretch. There are very few wash processed Ethiopian coffees that aren't geshes that score that level 5 mark, so higher side of level 4, I think there's really nice definition to it, no surprise in that. Finish, level 4. And it did have a little bit of that citric and herbal finish, so not necessarily my favorite part of this coffee, but given that the rest of the coffee was, we'll say, well structured and well defined enough, then I was okay with the finish, maybe not necessarily being the type of finish I was looking for. Maybe hoping for a little bit more of those stone fruits, those peachy components to it, but not necessarily the most pronounced for me. Acidity, level 4. So it was very interesting to me as I went back and I read Tim Wendelboe's write-up on this coffee, and they said maybe not necessarily as bright as some other Ethiopian coffees, and I said I can't help but chart this one somewhere between a 3 and a 4, as I feel like it still has enough brightness to score that level 4. But maybe this is by Tim Wendelboe standards, as I do know that they can have some very bright coffees in general, though this one for me, kind of charting between that 3 and a 4, I said it's close enough to that 4. It's closer to the 4 than it is to the 3, so let's put that up there. Florality, level 4. And one of the first notes I mentioned was that honeysuckle, and given that it was a little bit more of a honeyed florality as well as those white floral components, that kind of herbal white flower attributes, then there's plenty of florality in this one, and having it at a level 4, I would say maybe the most consistent characteristic to it, so definitely justified in that regard. Citrus fruit, level 4. And the main reason and the biggest selling points to me on this coffee was when I was able to get the lemon attributes, those more citric attributes, to be in a little bit more of a candied sense. So scoring that at the level 4, given that it's complemented by a little bit more sweetness, actually works kind of well for me. So I think that is a nice place to chart it. All right, handful of level 3s. We'll start with the sweetness at a level 3. And I don't think that this coffee was ever meant to go for sweetness. I mentioned that in the notes itself, as this coffee seems to maybe focus a little bit more on the articulation, the definition of it in general, but sweetness didn't seem to be a huge priority to it, as I don't think I could have ever justified bumping it anywhere above that level 3 mark. Yeah, it's just kind of the best way I can leave that part. Stone fruit, level 3. That's one thing that I was hoping for much more of within this coffee, though again, I don't think that I was ever expecting too much of the stone fruit components to it. This coffee honestly acted a lot of the way I expected it to act, not necessarily maybe an overly huge abundance of sweetness, much more clarity, a bit of herbality, and then just some citric qualities to it. So these things are all kind of in line with the expectation. As two more things worth discussing, the savoriness is there at that level 3, and that's that tea-like savory quality to it. There's a white tea note listed on here. I believe it's the first note that they have listed on here, and that's not surprising whatsoever, as it did seem to be a very, we'll just say, ever-present component within this one. And then the last thing worth discussing is the body at level 2. Not too much body within this one. I don't think I was necessarily expecting it to have an abundance of body. We are working with a wash-processed Ethiopian coffee, so that's in line with expectations. But as I am looking at this tasting wheel, yeah, it's expected results of this tasting wheel, but it's also a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. Usually one of the first things I say is that if a coffee does not score the level 4 in terms of the sweetness, then it's never necessarily going to be one of my favorite coffees. But this one right here, I'm not going to go above and say that it's one of my favorite washed Ethiopian coffees that we've ever reviewed on this channel. But like I often say with Tim Wendelboe, I can sit back and appreciate what the coffees are because I always feel like they're pretty well done. There's just really nice structure to them. And Tim Wendelboe's coffees in general seem to skew in a direction that doesn't cater to me. And I always appreciate somebody that's much more true to what they want. So Tim Wendelboe is much more true to that kind of herbal, really well structured, really well defined coffee, and the vast majority of our reviews have actually indicated that as well, is because that's typically what I experience from them. And this one was another example of that, as this coffee isn't necessarily going to be my type of washed Ethiopian coffee. I did want more sweetness, I wanted maybe a little less brightness, maybe a little less citrus, and a little bit more of those stone fruit aspects to it. But I still appreciated the slightly more unique profile that was present within this one. As one of the most boring things to do is review a wash processed Ethiopian coffee that offers nothing original, and this one felt a little bit more original than those ones. So that's why I enjoyed this perhaps a slight bit better than I would enjoy it typically on paper, but that's a testament to Tim Wendelboe, as I think that they did a pretty nice job with this coffee. Type of person I would suggest this one to. I do think that this is your classic Tim Wendelboe drinker, as it did have that very light profile to begin with, and then you complement that with a lot of those herbal qualities that are also ever present within it. And while maybe some people are searching for a little bit more brightness, it still has enough of the citric qualities and enough of the fruit definition throughout the rest of it to kind of make up for that, with that classic trademark Tim Wendelboe herbality as well. So I think all of those components does lend itself to your more traditional Tim Wendelboe drinker, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Echemo wash processed Ethiopia from Tim Wendelboe. Thanks for watching.